Welcome everyone to the UNM Law Mental Health Didactic Series. This series is hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're glad to have you all join us today. I'm Keith Hodges. I am a clinical assistant professor at the University of New Mexico in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. For our talk today, just some housekeeping rules. Please ask questions in the Q&A, not the chat box, anytime you have them. We usually leave about 15 minutes at the end of the hour to query questions. We try to get to as many as we can. Hopefully we'll get to yours, but if not, sorry. We do the best we can with the time we have. For those of you who want APA CEs, we're going to post a link towards the end of the talk. You just complete the survey and then you'll get your certificate. Make sure that you take a screenshot of that or print it because we don't keep copies. And for those who are looking for the CMEs, Alex will indicate a link in the chat here in a minute. I think he just did that actually. And so this talk is being recorded as well. So for anyone who can't make all of it or wants to see other talks, this should be posted within a week. And we have a lot of other kind of talks on there if you want to peruse those. And now that that's kind of passed, I'll get into our speaker for today. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alejandro Leguizamo. Dr. Leguizamo is a professor of psychology at Roger Williams University in Bristol, Rhode Island. His research interests include ethnic differences in sex offending, cultural issues in the treatment of people who have committed sex offenses, masculinity and sexual aggression, and cultural contributors to psychological well-being and life satisfaction. He also provides treatment, clinical consultation, and evaluations on a limited basis to the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services. He's currently a member of the board of directors for the Association for the Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Abuse, ATSA, where he serves as the chair of the Education and Training Committee. He's also an ATSA Fellow, and he regularly presents at regional national conferences and conducts trainings like this one and presentations, both online and in person on these topics. On behalf of the University of New Mexico, I'm excited to introduce you and I look forward to your talk, and I'll let you take it from here.
Right, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with you, wherever you are today, to talk to you about culture and sexual aggression. Given that this is recorded, I will keep the colorful language to a minimum. So let's get started. So our learning objectives for today is to analyze the power dynamics and societal and cultural factors that contribute to sexual aggression, describe how traditional masculinity and its expression contributes to sexual aggression, and applied practices that can help prevent sexual aggression by assessing the impact of cultural factors on its expression. A little bit about how I got to this particular topic. When we are thinking about sexual aggression, particularly in the forensic field, we generally are thinking or treating people that have been convicted of sexual offenses. That is a subset of the sexual aggression that takes place in societies. We know that sexual aggression is endemic, from sexual harassment all the way to, to be extremist about it, let's say sexual murder. And so everything in between. So what I'm going to focus on is the context on which all of that takes place. In psychology, psychiatry, all the mental health professions, we tend to focus on the individual and we tend to focus on the pathology of the individual. So when we're dealing with people convicted or charged with sex offenses, we are talking about, we start throwing terms like deviance, which I hate. And I will tell you, use sexual pathology. If the person does have a paraphilic disorder or something like that, but, I work in a university, there's plenty of sexual aggression happening there that is not being reported, is not being prosecuted, and obviously the people are not going into the justice system. So I like to take a very systemic approach, partly because my dissertation chair forced me to do so when looking at juveniles convicted of sex offenses. So I am a big advocate of Brenner's ecological systems model, which has been adopted by the APA, the Psychological Association, in order to look at, in order to assess and treat individuals in a culturally sensitive way. And I'll also say that culturally sensitive doesn't mean that, okay, when treating a minority person, ethnic, sexual minority, I'm not saying that. Everybody who has a culture that is going to be a little bit different from us. So you can have somebody that is just like you from the same ethnic group, same sexual orientation, and you're in New Mexico and say that you were born and raised there, and the person came from Rhode Island, as the Newport Bridge. And there's going to be language differences. There's going to be all kinds of like regional mannerisms, customs that require that cultural sensitivity. Okay, so I want everybody to think in more global terms as opposed to diversity or culture, meaning particular. So therefore, I used the ecological systems model where we look at the endosystem, the individual, their characteristics. If you were evaluating or treating, it could be mental illness, it could be genetic conditions, intellectual quotient, all kinds of things that are particular of that individual. Those characteristics interact with microsystems such as the family, the neighbors, neighborhood, and that contributes to the person's development, but also it contributes to the person's beliefs, their attitudes, what we may think of as cognitive distortions that I'll tell you more about those a little bit later. So then we're looking at broader systems, mesosystems, more of a broader community, to the macro system, which involves society as a whole in a more general way. That's more where my thinking is in regards to this presentation, looking at those microsystemic contributors to sexual aggression. They interact with the mesosystem and with the microsystems, as well as the chronosystem. Chronosystem, past experiences, histories, generation, all of these things are going to be involved in how we think about sexual aggression. For example, a number of years back, I decided to be a little bit more culture. I bought a couple of books written by Cervantes. So I got Don Quixote, because I never read it in Spanish. I'm from Mexico, I should say. And a book of short stories. And I was reading the short stories until we got to, until I got to a rape scene that was treated very nonchalantly. And, that was something that appears to be run of the mill in the, whenever Cervantes was alive, 16, 1700s. So I closed the book and I said, okay, I don't want to read about that. It's like work. So the way that we think about sexual aggression changes depending on a lot of societal and generational factors. Okay, prime example, the Me Too. So those are the frameworks that we use, or I'm going to use. Now, when we conceptualize sexual aggression, we have two venues of study. We have research with community samples, and that is Malamuth and his colleagues developed the confluence model, which involves the interaction between hostile masculinity and impersonal sex. There have been some refinement with that model, where others have added alcohol use during sex. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around that. But those are factors that contribute to sexual aggression in communities. Well, I shouldn't say communities, they're college samples. Okay. So hostile masculinity, you may have heard it as toxic masculinity. It is actually not that. When we start using terms like toxic or hostile, it seems like it's all the way out there. It's actually traditional masculinity, where there's the belief that men are superior to women and everybody else, gender-wise, and that men have are entitled to sexual activity whenever they basically, and if it doesn't happen consensually, by force or coercion. Okay. Now there have been a couple of studies where community members, not college samples, but community members have been studied. One by Hall, Gordon Nagayama Hall in LA, where he and his team tested the confluence model with a white sample, a Asian American sample, and maybe a Hawaiian sample. Don't quote me on that one. And what they found was that there were some cultural exacerbating factors with respect to sexual aggression for Asian American men, but also there were some cultural protective factors. And the protective factors were ethnic identity. The more the person was, the prouder they were, more curious they were about their background, not their ethnicity, they were less likely to engage in sexually aggressive behavior, broadly defined. I don't have the reference here, but I'm working on a write-up now on a community sample of Latinos where we found the same thing. The strongest protective factor was ethnic identity. Now, on convicted samples, which is more of what we tend to see in circles, we have these etiological explanations of offending behaviors or of risk. And they tend to involve some developmental antecedents. Right now, adverse childhood experiences are in vogue. So there's a lot of research. You gotta laugh at what becomes the focus. At some point it was psychopathy. It's like everybody's a psychopath. Now it's ACEs, and sure, they contribute. Sexual abuse, other developmental antecedents are early problematic sexual behavior or early problematic sexuality, paraphilic tendencies, social regression, parental separation, so treatment, psychiatric treatment, obscurity, conduct disorder, things that are kind of like we can agree on all bad developmental events. And also psychological vulnerabilities, something that is a little bit more dynamic, problems with emotional regulation, consumption of problematic porn, or we'll talk a little bit about that later, and that increasing the risk. There are a lot of other factors, even community factors such as increased gun ownership or availability of guns that has been found by Stinson and Carpenter, and also housing instability, Reinberg and Hübner. So those are kind of like factors. But again, so actually those are some community samples, community factors, and criminologists tend to be a little bit more interested in the context that we are. But if we are assessing or we are treating individuals that have engaged in sexually aggressive behavior, we need to be able to think about those factors as well. All right, so what about culture? How does it contribute to sexual aggression? And here we're going to go a little back. I'm sure that this is just one example, so don't think that this is it. Culture, sexual aggression really is an expression of patriarchy, of dominance and entitlement. I will tell you that, well, it's right there, that sexual aggression is absent in egalitarian or matriarchal societies. I'll tell you a little bit about that. So in places like ancient Rome and Greece, I just haven't done the research to look at other places, China, India, places with long-standing histories and cultures. But at least in the Western world, in Europe, in Rome and Greece, there was plenty of sexual aggression. Both societies were very patriarchal and hierarchical. So men were on top, women were in a subservient position, as well as children and as well as slaves. So Roman men had pretty much a go with whatever they wanted to do with women, with prostitutes. There were actually two types of prostitutes. There were one prostitute just for sex and concubines for sex and general entertainment, and wives only for kids. And while the men could do all kinds of things, women were severely punished if they engaged in similar behaviors. Also, in both Rome and Greece, there was the men had the entitlement of engaging in sex with slaves. And we know from our own history about the abuse of African-American women by slave masters during the time of that they were slaves in the U.S. So the same thing has been going on for a really, really long time. And given that that's the base, those are the basis for cultures, we can see that the roots are very, very. Another type of cultural expression of the patriarchy that lends itself to sexual aggression is war. Rape has been endemic in most conflicts. There are some exceptions that I'll get to. I keep saying that we'll get to it. We'll get to it. But rape and war didn't get as much attention until we got to the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, where that surfaced and there was an increased awareness of that. So that aggression perpetrated by men towards the women and men, actually, of the group with which they have conflict, serve the purpose of establishing dominance and really engaging, creating or inflicting a considerable amount of physical and psychological harm, not only to those individuals, but collectively to that culture and the identity of that group that was attacked. That is just an example. The Balkans, this is happening any place that where there is conflict, and regardless of who is involved. So those are some of the broad brushstrokes in regards to patriarchal sexual aggression. In contrast, we have cultures, matriarchal societies, where the gender roles are different. They tend to be more egalitarian, even though so it's not that men tend to be in a submissive role, but rather there is more, the conditions are more egalitarian between men and women. For example, the Bisu in Tibet, it's a matriarchal society where there is a separation between gender roles and sexuality. What happens there is that women remain in the matriarchal household with their mothers, and they are free to be sexual with any man that they want. And when they have children, the children are raised by them and her family, and the male role models for the child are the uncles. So the biological father is involved, but he's not involved in a central way with the child. So that there is no confluence of kind of like this sexuality, conflict in sex. So the dynamic is very different there. There are other matriarchal societies in Latin America or other places in Asia where the same is true. The more power or the less oppression to women in a particular group, the freer they are to express themselves sexually, the less sexual aggression there is. There's a particular documentary about a group in northern Cambodia. You can just Google Cambodia sex arts, and girls there, teenage girls there, are free to. They ask their fathers to make them a separate part from the family, and they're free to entertain and talk to boys there, talk means sex, if the girl wants. So the girl is the one that chooses who to take back to the girlfriend, and she has the power to decide what happens. So if something happens, it's because she was the one controlling. And as you could imagine, if the boy does something that the girl doesn't like, all the other girls learn about it. So the boys are the way that they approach these interactions is quite different from what we see in college. Other egalitarian societies are actually those in pre-European US with Native American nations. Native American nations, there were, I don't know, many, there were many, and they all have very different traditions. However, we know there's a book that is escaping right now that it might be the history of everything. It's by two scholars from who are kind of like reinterpreting archaeological findings to talk about human history. But at any rate, they write about Native American groups being highly egalitarian, where in many places the chief had as much power as how much he could convince people in his group to do something. So everybody could say no. So there was less aggression, more conversations rather. Actually, they argued that that's what led to the European title Enlightenment, because Native American thinkers were talking to the British, like, why are you guys fighting each other like this? You treat each other badly. What's up with that? And that led to the concept of freedom being developed in Europe. You know, if you think about it, the feuds in Europe, if you were a peasant, you weren't free to go anywhere because you had to work for the land. In Native America, that wasn't the case. You could go. Now that egalitarian nature of the Native American groups also led to some interesting occurrences. One, I cannot remember my source, and it kills me because I read it. There are writings by an American colonel in 1800s who got to Ohio, maybe Indiana, and he wrote about the Iroquois, that area of the country, and wrote in his journal with surprise that they didn't rape their prisoners. And to him, it was like, that's what you do with your prisoners, you rape them. But these people didn't do that. As it turns out, and this is from the research from McKay, a historian, in the eastern woodlands of the US, tribes tended to be very egalitarian. Women, men, and children, all of them contribute to the group in ways that were equally appreciated. So the men did whatever, the women did whatever, and the children were apprentices to the adults. So that was very different from the Puritan practices of the colonies, where there was a strong hierarchy, there was a lot of misogyny, a lot of oppression of women. And as luck would have it, or despite of how much Native Americans were maligned and referred to as savages, Native American groups ended up, when they lost members of their tribe, they would go elsewhere and they would kidnap women and children, and they would incorporate them into their tribes as a way to replace individuals. And colonial women were scared about these events, and as you can imagine. But once they got to the tribal area, they were incorporated as members of families. There were daughters, there were sisters, there were eventually spouses. Some of them were adopted by the chief's families, and they were conceptualized as being raped by the colonists. However, I will tell you, the experience of the women was so different that I will read to you something that Benjamin Franklin wrote. He noted with amazement that many of these discontented Europeans took the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods from whence there was no reclaiming. So the women, when they were rescued by the colonists and they went back to the oppression, to the patriarchal Puritan practices, they ended up escaping and going back to the tribal lands because they were actually treated better. So in those cultures, now I'm limited this to the eastern woodlands. In the west, you will know more than I, so I won't go there. But certainly a lot of very interesting ways that Native American societies function that were less conducive to this type of behavior. All right, so now that we have talked a little bit about that, let's fast forward a little bit into what we think about masculinity. So the background of sexual aggression, we have societal practices cemented or built upon the patriarchy, and which argues for the superiority of men. And then we go into how is that expressed in societal, in the expectations of what is a man supposed to be. And when I say man, I mean any type of masculinity, so I'm including trans men in this particular group. And this traditional masculinity involves three main facets. Status. So we have to strive for status. We're supposed to be competitive. We're supposed to be out there fighting. We're supposed to be tough. So we can't shy away from a fight. We have to, I'm just having a thought here because I have been in 2 fights in my life, both in 2nd grade. So as far as this is concerned, I'm doing well. And also anti-femininity. You can, if you want to, really disorganize a group of like 8-year-old boys in some sort of like field, you can just tell them, oh, you throw like a girl and all hell breaks loose because of this concept of not wanting to, this concept of having to divorce ourselves from any type of feminine quality. And that includes feelings and the expression of feelings and the expression of affection. And we have to think our forebears or our foreparents in psychology and psychiatry who, as a result of the eugenic thinking from Europe, began to regard homosexuality as a mental illness, and any type of interaction between men where their sexual orientation could be questioned was prohibited. And so we have the inability or the prohibition for expressing emotions or vulnerability. I can tell you, and actually this would be more familiar out there in the Southwest, perhaps, I don't know. But when I communicate with my friends in Mexico, I sign off, we sign off like, I'm sending you a strong hug. And that's how we say goodbye. Just imagine, men in the US, signing off their emails like hugs and, friend. That doesn't happen because of this particular view that really tries to discourage femininity or anything having to do with what is perceived as feminine. And traditional masculinity has been found in research to be associated with sexual aggression, with attitudes conducive to sexual aggression and to actual sexual aggression. We don't have to look much further than frats in sports, where this traditional masculinity and these facets are very much encouraged and nurtured so that there is significant sexual aggression. There's the entitlement, there's the groupthink. We don't know if it is certain types of men are more likely to get involved in those groups, or whether it is the group culture that influences the individual that may not otherwise engage in such behavior. But, we have heard about all, college frats, books about how to get women to have sex, they want not, all kinds of other sexually aggressive behaviors that are encouraged. And we know that in these two groups in particular, the sexual aggression is more prevalent than men not in those groups. Okay, so with this traditional masculinity, we have these are kind of like the facets that are out there in the psychology of men. This emphasis again on status, toughness, and femininity. Now, what this gets, the problem here is that just like with women having unrealistic ideals in society, this society, so do men. So not all of us can have a very high status. Not all of us can be, tremendously tough and strong. Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was young, and we all have our heart, and we have our sensitivities, and we have feelings, and so it's a problem. These are ideals that are very difficult to satisfy. Now, in practical terms, what this means for men is that there is this expectation of prowess. So we are expected to be able to provide. This is kind of like the bread. So we're supposed to have economic prowess. We're supposed to make more than women. We're supposed to have jobs, and women, if our female partner has a job and we don't, then that's a problem. We are supposed to have physical prowess. So we have issues with men that are muscular, or they're not tall enough, or they're not athletic enough. And we also have this expectation of sexual prowess. So we all are supposed to have very large genitals. We're supposed to be ready for sex at any moment, and we're supposed to be able to hook up with anybody at the drop of a hat. And these are all listed, unattainable, and they lead to compensatory behaviors that are problematic. So some examples. This is from sociologist Meltzer from his book, Mindhood Impossible, very good book, is that those who have lost their economic power, so they have lost their job, or they don't make as much as the female, they could engage in compensatory behaviors, given a sense of inadequacy that can include physical and or sexual aggression towards their partners in order to regain sort of that power that they feel it should be theirs. So that's a problem. Physical prowess, again, it can the compensatory behaviors can involve compulsive working out, eating issues regarding to muscle, trying to bulk up, to the use of performance-enhancing substances in order to become more muscular, and also then the compensatory behaviors. Actually, Meltzer, as part of his research for the book, he joined a few fight clubs. Apparently, it's a thing. One in San Francisco, where middle-aged men went to exercise their ghosts of playgrounds past, and they would fight one another in a controlled environment, so nobody would die. But people would get hurt, but it was their way to sort of like regain this sort of like masculinity. And sexual practice. If you have dealt with people convicted of sex offenses, there are plenty of times where the offenses were the result of rejection. And here is where I tell you, and sorry to say this, but in many ways, masculinity is rather fragile. Sometimes it feels that it's like a dandelion, a windy day, because anything that questions that masculinity leads to such a response because of this insecurity. So sexual aggression, physical aggression, and we see it in the news with people that even murder individual because of religion. So again, those are problematic because of these expectations that are placed on men. And that is a problem. Now, interestingly, there is also aggression that is conceptualized within the practice of masculinity. And this involves it can involve queer women and also trans individuals. And this is really, really interesting. This is from Bedera and North, where queer women are at higher risk of being victimized of sexual aggression. And what she told me in the conversation was that it wasn't that this idea that there's a lesbian woman and that the man thinks they're going to turn that woman sexual, but rather the thinking from the research is that the man thinks there is a lesbian woman. I am going to be the one, the man that is going to have sex with her, and for lack of a better word, that is supposedly like archetypal or something like that. So problem number one, that expression of masculinity. Interestingly, too, in her research, she has found that among trans individuals, there can be an expression of sexual aggression from trans men as trans men begin to or practice masculinity in a way that is as stereotypical as possible, so that they end up engaging in traditional masculine behavior, traditionally in a bad way. So they may engage in sexual aggression as an expression of dominance, as an expression of their masculinity. And on the other side of the coin, what she reports is of some trans women engaging in sexual aggression because the person wasn't ready to contend with the different treatment that they will have, having transition from male to female, and the ensuing decrease in social power in this society. So those were really, really interesting findings that she had. So we have this masculinity being a problem here that we need to contend. So we will see what, this doesn't mean that men can be men, can be women, and everything in between. As I said, you can be a man, just don't be a jerk. Kind of thing. So what about oppression and sexual aggression? Here we can get into a little bit of ethnicity, but we need to put it in the context of colonization and what is doing coloniality. So we have many groups that have experienced colonialism. They were colonized, they were oppressed by a colonial power. Now, what happens is that in addition to that level of oppression and interactions, the colonizer imposes their practices, their gender roles, the traditions upon the colonized. And that remains. So that is coloniality. So today, these days, Mexicans don't have the gender roles that the Aztecs or the Maya or any other group had because of the coloniality impact from the Spanish. Same thing with Africa, same thing in Asia as well. We have the examples that I told you before from Native American tribes, where in the present there is a higher incidence of domestic violence, of sexual aggression, and that is the result of the colonial oppression, the continued coloniality, in addition to the cultural trauma from the physical cultural genocide. in many of the groups in the US. In Latin America, there was more of a amalgamation of cultures, but that doesn't still with the oppression that comes from colonial rule. In addition, the powers that be, the Europeans, were able to then provide the narrative about how the groups that were being oppressed were like. So just as I told you before, that the narrative was that Native Americans were savages, and they were raping white women, all of them. The same thing was applied to African Americans, where the African American male was seen as dangerous if they rose in any level. So actually, those during slavery, the ones that showed signs of leadership or strength were systematically removed, killed, in order to prevent uprisings by states. Also, there were the narrative began about them being sexually aggressive, particularly towards white women, in order to keep them in that kind of like dangerous drawer. Never mind that white masters were raping African American women. But obviously they controlled the narrative. Now, that also involved the hypersexualization of African American women. There were writings about African women being taken to Europe and displayed nude in classes in Europe in order showcase their sexuality. They didn't cover themselves like Europeans did, because in Africa it's hot, so it works best not to have a lot of clothes because it's very hot. Same thing with India, yeah, same thing with Latin America. So there's, on the one hand, there's this hypersexualization of individuals, but there's also the opposite. So African American women, there's a narrative of the hypersexual and the hyper-strong, and neither of them is good, because then even for African American men, then the woman becomes either a sex object or this powerful being that is there to control them, and one is being controlled and oppressed by society as a whole. So that's not a good situation either. But it's a good way to control the population. In the sex offender, for lack of a better word, research with regards to ethnicity, there's very little research out there. In the 70s, there were a couple of articles published, but basically they were trying to prove that African American men rape of white women at higher rates than African American women. And when they couldn't prove that, basically people lost interest. As it turns out, as we know, people tend to be sexually aggressive with people they know. So the same goes with ethnic groups. At least there's no research right now, so I can tell you now. But back then, in the 70s, white men were raping white women, black men were raping black women. There could have been, and I'm sure that there was, white men raping black women. Unfortunately, black women were unable to engage the justice system to be able to have the men be held responsible by the legal system. Similar thing happened with Latinos, with the conceptualization of Latino women as seductive, highly sexualized. We have this stereotype or archetype of the Madonna or whore. So women are either mothers or they're there for sexual purposes, and there's no mix. I think it's getting a little bit better. But I can tell you, when I was in Mexico, that was very prevalent and led to very bad, like, sexual lives, married individuals, plenty of extramarital affairs. There's also the hypersexualization of Latin men, the Latin lover, the suave, kind of like guy that you interact with and take a shower afterwards. So again, these are stereotypes, archetypes being imposed on by the powers that be. And with Asians, we have the hypersexualization of Asian women, like this exoticization, that's a word. Expectation of submissiveness and kind of like fragility. Or also there's kind of like the strong middle-aged Asian woman that's similar to African American, very strong. And in this case with Asian men, the under-sexualization, the emasculation about Asian men being feminine. So again, this there's no research at this point, but we gotta explore, you know, these societal messages and discrimination, oppression can express themselves in ensuing sexual aggression in order to express dominance or deal with the feeling of powerlessness. In the study that I told you about with Latinos and the confluence one, we have a lot of stats to still to run, but one thing that we found was that anger also predicted sexual aggression. And I think that that is going to be either mediated or moderated by discrimination. Actually, it's going to be mediated discrimination, anger, and sexual aggression. But that's still to be seen. All right, so what can we do? We have this culture that is patriarchal, that is hierarchical. We have men, particularly white men, high up, and everybody else underneath with different levels of decreased power. And how can we deal with this? And so some potentials here. We're doing assessments of you're doing treatment. First of all, you know, we need to conduct very thorough assessments. Cultural values, what are gender roles? What are their beliefs? You know, their beliefs, cognitive distortions, or societal norms. You know, if the person thinks that, oh, you know, if a woman talks to me, they want sex, is that really a cognitive distortion? Because if so many people have that thought process, then it's more of a societal. We need to address it as such. I very much believe in not holding the individual responsible for their culture. So when I was doing treatment center in Massachusetts with Latin American men, you know, I didn't hold them responsible for their belief that, you know, older men should be able to have sex with like teenage girls, because I know where that comes from in the culture. I can tell you, grandfather was 32 when he married my grandmother, and she was 16. Granted that this was in the 1920s, and the idea was very economic. Yeah, that my great-grandmother wanted to get rid of my grandmother, and this guy was economically viable, so they married him off. Was it a love affair? No, absolutely not. She died in her 50s, probably trying to get away from it. But that's a different story altogether. But that doesn't mean that we cannot challenge the people that we're working with in critically assessing their cultural values. Same thing here. Doesn't matter if the person is from Latin America or from Ohio. You know, where are you getting these messages? Where are the expectations? What are their beliefs? What are you looking at? What is happening in the media? What is the media telling you? about gender roles, about sexuality, about expectations, and I'm going to show you a little bit of a little video involving porn stars. It's not a porn video, but it really underscores number one, the messages that people, particularly in formative years, get, and also how cool the New Zealand government is. So I am going to share this. Actually, and we're going to watch this video.
Hiya, I'm Sue. This is Derek. We're here because your son just looked us up online, to watch us.
Matt, darling, there's some people here to see you. So he watches you online?
Yeah, on his laptop.
iPad, PlayStation.
His phone, your phone.
Smart TV, projector.
Yeah, anyway, we usually perform for adults, but your son's just a kid. He might not know how relationships actually work. We don't even talk about consent, do we? No, we just get straight to it.
Yeah, and I'd never act like that in real life.
Nah. Hey, Maddie. You right?
Okay, Sandro, stay calm. You know what to do here. All right, Maddie. It sounds like it's time to have a talk about the difference between what you see online and real-life relationships. No judgment.
Many young Kiwis are using porn to learn about sex. Keep it real online. Get help and advice at keepitrealonline.govt.nz.
Now, I dream of any day that we can do something like that in the US, but that it's likely not possible. But certainly, we need to assess what cultural messages the people that we're working with are getting from the media, and in particular from porn. Even though the research shows that only extreme forms of porn, rape porn, and child porn lead to sexual aggression, we also do know that porn is becoming more and more aggressive with choking and with slapping, and that is being translated into more of those behaviors being experienced by women in the community, younger women, particularly, from their sexual partners. So those are problems, and really there's all kinds of issues with porn. But one of the main problems here is the unrealistic expectations that the men have, and women as well. So what are some potential interventions is fomenting awareness of these gender roles and sexual gender roles, and assessing them critically, and trying to foster not only the people that we work with, but also yourselves, transformative masculinity, reframing these ideals of what it means to be, what it means to have this physical prowess, economic prowess, or sexual prowess, in the sense of physically, what am I able to do with my body, even though I'm not trusting an example? And how can I contribute to the world around me in a positive way, even regardless of my physical makeup? Economic, how I can contribute to the household that I'm in a way that is fulfilling and meaningful, even if that is not economic. I can tell you, my wife is working very hard right now, and we're getting ready for my daughter's quinceañera, so she's crazy busy. So I'm doing a lot of the housework, and that is part of my contribution usually, but I have to do more now. It is very, very hard. So, but that is what's required in order for our household to run smoothly. So even if there is power, in a sense, in the man that is now working, who is keeping the house order, and with their partner being able to then provide the economic needs, and thinking about that. And some of Meltzer's research the men that were able to refrain, to make that refrainment in their relationships were more fulfilled and have better relationships with their partners. And sexual, communication, realistic expectations, problems seems to come up, particularly with college students, when the man, the young man has very poor social skills and has these expectations that they're entitled to have sex with the most beautiful person they see, as opposed to being more interested in the interaction, being more realistic, and having better ways to engage the individuals. I did a video as part of a series about healthy sexuality, and like it would be a lot better if men just like in dating apps, we just like state, I'm interested in having sex, no strings attached, as opposed to, making some sort of story and then following up any type of interaction by women with a photo of their genitals. Be a lot better to be honest from the get-go. Support social change. This is very, very, very hard because changing a society is like cooking a small fish, to quote Confucius. Has to be very careful. But one of the positives is things like Ted Lasso, the show Ted Lasso, where this sensitive guy who's in touch with his emotions for the most part, really is it's a cool role model, even to the point that I read that American basketball teams were watching the show in order to kind of like encourage their coaches to be more like Ted, and to practice it at home with our children, with regardless of their biological gender expression. The idea that we are complete humans, so we all experience the same emotions. We all should be able to express them in appropriate ways, so that they don't come out in compensatory ways, via fighting or other ways. And that slowly will begin to change our culture. I do have a lot of I'm very optimistic seeing my daughter and friends. Granted that they're still like artichokes trying to play chess, so they're clueless in many ways, but there is more affection between the boys and their friends, which is a good sign. And there is a little bit more of an emotional acceptance. And there's more acceptance of diversity, both ethnic and sexual and gender. So I think that we are in a good route to address some of these issues. All right, so
sorry to interject real quick, but we're 2 minutes past the hour and I wanted to be thoughtful of everybody's time. And so I'll just say that in the chat, we actually do have the link for those of you who want to complete the CEs. Dr. Leguizamo, if you want to wrap up in the next few seconds. Oh, look at that, perfect timing. We do actually have a few questions, if you'd like to answer some of those.
Sure.
All right. So I just kind of read these out loud and I'll let you kind of take it away. The first question is somewhat tangential to the issue of sexual aggression. And it says the vast majority of mass murderers, family murder suicides, and completed suicides are perpetrated by men. How do we as a society address male gun violence in such a politicized, patriarchal environment?
Wow. So right off the bat, huh? All right. Well, this is just my opinion, and as you would have seen, they're not necessarily those of University of New Mexico and all of that. But number one, probably have to have a very different relationship with guns, and perhaps go like Australia went with gun control. After they enacted gun control laws that were very reasonable, these are Australians talking. There was a show on 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes, or I don't know, I can't remember. But in addition to having reasonable boundaries, there's also, I think that raising boys and having men that are more emotionally resilient, that could prevent these outbursts that tend to be related to an experience of feeling of submission or rejection, and hopefully, if the person are better able to contain with those feelings, we could have prevented those events. I haven't read the literature on mass murderers, but there tends to be, it seems that there's a lot of disillusionment and resentment and hatred that I think could be addressed early on. We're able to change our tune on how many particular boys deal with emotions.
Okay, we actually have two questions related to prison culture. So one person just kind of asked you to speak generally about sexual aggression and how it operates within the culture of prison. And then another person sort of got more specific and asked if you could speak to what prisons do to masculinity and how extended stays in male prisons affect them when they're released back into society.
Okay. Prisons are a concentrated environment of power and dominance, where there is no respect for the inmates. Their names are, they're taken over by number. Everything is about hierarchies and losing power, and how can people exploit others. Given also that there's a decrease in sexual opportunities, that dominance also is going to be expressed in a sexual through sexual aggression. But it is very much that concentrated system where the oppressiveness of the environment is going to lead to this type of behavior. I don't know the stats from more progressive prison systems, but I would look into the incidence of sexual aggression in Norwegian prisons. They tend to focus a lot more on rehabilitation, and the same with the maximum security prison in Cyprus, which is directed by a human rights attorney, and where the aggression between the guards to the men, to the inmates, basically has disappeared because of a change in culture and increased training of the COs. So the more comfortable the person is in a prison environment, again, we can hopefully prevent it. Unfortunately, that the person who is begins to act in a certain way in a prison setting in order to be able to adapt to that system, then that doesn't help them in the outside because the system is very, very different. But the way that we treat our inmates it's problematic and conducive to increased aggression.
Okay, we have a question here that says, would you consider any instances in which a lack of masculinity is a factor contributing to abuse and or other negative outcomes?
I don't know exactly what that would look like. The only thing that I can think of is if the person is gender non-binary, kind of like gender non-binary, so gender queer and asexual, which is an orientation. I don't see how that would be problematic. The only problem that I see is the potential response from other people, but not inherently for the person.
Okay. What are your thoughts on addressing or countering internet personalities promoting traditional masculinity? And as an example, they provide Andrew Tate as someone who might qualify as that.
Well, number one, thank God for, what's her name, Thunberg, the Norwegian teenager who basically gave him a very tough lesson on Twitter. So that's one way of countering it. I think I have thought of, like, why is it that we don't have sort of like counterpoints? The thing is that, when you're online, is the more excitable you are and you yell, you are animated, the more popular you're going to be. And it's kind of like difficult to do that when you're like, it's cool to express your emotions. Doesn't quite have the same kind of like appeal, I would say. I think that we, just like with anything, critical thinking about what the person says. If with those personalities that are like, saying all kinds of hateful things and all kinds of things are coming our way, if we kind of like go through that line of thinking a few steps, the logic just falls apart. Okay. Women just want to replace men, whatever. No, who's saying that? And that's really not practical. We shouldn't go back to an era like the 50s, where middle class, because minorities and poor people, everybody worked, they had to. But we need everybody to be fully engaged in order for the country to be able to function. For example, I think having more popular things like Ted Lasso and other role models, I think will be important as well. But it goes to the parents, it goes to teachers, it goes to neighbors. Everybody needs to be involved. And if the parents are not, then the people around.
Okay, this is probably our last question. Could you clarify the mindset of those studied who sexually offend against lesbians in particular?
The way that Nicole Bedera explained it to me is that that aggression is not, it does not involve kind of like this kind of like pornography related idea of like watching lesbian porn where two women are having sex with one another and the man shows up and joins in, which is very unrealistic. But rather that the intention of the men in college, that's the population that she studies, that have engaged in sexual aggression targeting lesbian women, involves the idea that they're going to be the one man that is going to have sex with that particular woman, that her sexual experience with a man is going to be limited to him. So it's kind of like a very narcissistic, self-importance kind of like way of thinking about themselves. I hope that answers. That's kind of like as far as I understand.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you again, Dr. Leguizamo, for giving this really interesting talk and for giving us a little bit of a taste of how much better New Zealand infomercials are than the States. We'll get there someday, I hope. And everyone join us next week next week we have Dr. Helmus, who's discussing the communication of risk and influences on interpreting risk. So thanks again and see everyone next week.
Bye. Thank you.